Good evening, everyone. Wonderful to see you all here on such a blowy night. Thanks for braving the weather to come. I'm Stephanie Exton, the CEO of Mornington Peninsula Foundation, and I'd like to acknowledge the Bunurong people, the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And just reflecting on the way down, I was thinking how amazing it is that for not just thousands, but for tens of thousands of years, essential information, knowledge, wisdom has always been transferred effectively and efficiently in traditional cultures through oral language, dance, song. Oral language is a feature of tonight. And in fact, communication really is at the heart of a lot of what MPF does, because it's communication that allows collaboration, and that's how the human species thrives and survives. So I'd like to pay my respects to elders, to the traditional owners, acknowledge the incredible expertise, their knowledge of language, memory systems, and really respect our First Nations peoples. And I'd like to pay my respects to any Aboriginal people who are here with us tonight. It's my great honour and pleasure to introduce the founder, the chairman, Ian Hicks of the Mornington Peninsula Foundation, business leader, philanthropist, patron of the arts, and altogether good guy.
I can't lean down that far, so I'll have to put it up here. Well, Stephanie's sort of semi-stolen something I wanted to say, and I was going to say, thank you for coming out for this amazing wet, it's not so wet, but windy and wavy, all the W's, wet, windy, wavy night. I can't remember seeing waves any bigger than this on Port Phillip Bay, but thank you very much for all making the effort to come here. On behalf of the board of MPF, and also on behalf of Professor Theo Farrell and the Trobe University, I'd like to welcome you all here tonight. This is our third Oration with Trobe University, and in this same venue. It's been very successful, and it's very well publicised and promoted, and it's just turning out to be a fabulously popular event for people who are interested in what we've got to say. So welcome everyone. And tonight, of course, we're going to hear from the oration from distinguished Professor Pamela Snow, which you'll hear about in a minute. So it's great to have you all here. And once again, many thanks for coming. I'd like to hand over to Kathy, the co-chairman, the vice chairman of the MPF, who's going to do a further introduction. Thanks very much.
A little bit shorter. Well, thanks so much, Ian, for the introduction, and thank you, Ian, for the extraordinary and entrepreneurial spirit, vision, and financial support you bring to MPF, without which the foundation would not have been able to achieve the outcomes that it has. Hello and welcome to all of you. It's my great pleasure to introduce you tonight to La Trobe University distinguished Professor Pamela Snow. We were delighted when Professor Snow accepted our offer to deliver the oration. Her extensive research into the role of literacy and language skills as fundamental to development in childhood and adolescence aligns perfectly with the work that MPF is committed to in schools and family support on the Mornington Peninsula. And under the outstanding leadership of our chairman, Ian Hicks, MPF began this work in 2018. And we did it after conversations with principals and educators revealed how low oral language and literacy skills were, and just how strongly that was correlating with low rates of school engagement and completion. And thanks to the support of generous donors, many of whom are here tonight, who invested in essential resources and professional development for teachers in the science of learning, we're now celebrating some great outcomes with our schools. To our speaker, Pamela is Professor of Cognitive Psychology in the School of Education at the Bendigo campus of Trobe University, and she's also co-director and co-founder of the Science of Language and Reading, or SOLAR Lab, in the School of Education at La Trobe University. A registered psychologist, having qualified originally in speech-language pathology, a perfect combination, Pamela has taught a wide range of undergraduate and postgraduate education and health professionals. Pamela has conducted research on the profiles and needs of high-risk groups such as youth offenders, children and adolescents in the state care system and flexible education systems, as well as research advancing evidence in the language to literacy transition in the early years of school. In 2020, this is not the... Forgive me. 2020, Pamela established with her colleague, Professor Tanya Seri, who is also here this evening, the SOLAR Lab, and together they've designed and delivered online courses for school staff, completed by over 12,000 participants in their first 4 years, developed a language and literacy stream in the La Trobe Masters of Education, and created a graduate certificate in education, language and literacy. Pamela has over 200 publications to her name and was a member of the 2017 National Year 1 Literacy and Numeracy Panel convened by the then Honourable Simon Birmingham, the Federal Education Minister at the time. In addition to her wide-ranging academic outputs, Pamela also writes a popular blog for teachers, parents and clinicians, The Snow Report, which has over 1.25 million views since its establishment, which is pretty impressive, and is a founding associate editor of the Reading League Journal. And in September 1924, in acknowledgement of all of this, Pamela was named by the Australian Financial Review as one of the 5 most powerful people in education in Australia. This evening, Pamela will present her oration, Reading Instruction in Australian Schools, Headwinds, Tailwinds and Crosswinds. Reading is one of the most studied yet most contentious aspects of early years education. In spite of decades of robust research on the reading process and reading instruction, we continue to leave about a third of Australian children behind on this most fundamental skill for academic and life success. Distinguished Professor Snow will explore historical and ideological factors that have hindered knowledge translation in recent decades, and will argue for higher levels of accountability in university faculties of education as a matter of public urgency. So please join me in welcoming distinguished Professor Pamela Snow.
Thank you, Cappy, and Stephanie and Ian for that very warm welcome. It does feel like we've been doing this for over 100 years some days. Now, it's a great honour to be asked to deliver this address, and I'd like to extend my thanks to the Mornington Peninsula Foundation, and in particular to Stephanie Exton, Ian Hicks and Kathy Celso for their kind invitation. I hope you are all enjoying the immersive experience that the organisers have arranged for you tonight to line up with the title of my presentation. That they've gone to quite some effort in that respect. Now, my esteemed colleague, Professor Tanya Seri, is unfortunately an apology for this evening, but I would like to acknowledge her enormous contribution to a lot of the work and thinking that I'm going to describe tonight. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence tonight of Professor Joanna Barbusis, the Dean of Education and Pro-Vice Chancellor, who courageously gave Tanya and me the keys to the initial teacher education, or ITE, that's an acronym you're going to hear a lot tonight, the ITE Reading Instruction Cabinet 5 years ago, and said, fix it. More on this later. And of course, I'm delighted that we're joined by our Vice Chancellor, Professor Theo Farrell. Neville and Di Bertali are apologies this evening, but I'd like to acknowledge also their generous support of our work. Now, I gave a similar presentation to tonight's at the University of Tasmania last month, the Sandy Duncanson Social Justice Memorial Lecture. And some of you may have listened to the online recording of that event. I'd like to be able to say that both the landscape and my thoughts on it have rocketed along in the intervening 5 weeks, necessitating a whole new presentation. Not surprisingly, that's not the case, so there will be some overlap between that presentation and my comments tonight. That just means that some of you will do better on the high-stakes test at the end than others. In our time together this evening, I'd like to use the metaphor of headwinds, tailwinds and crosswinds to explore our path to this point in history in 2025 and consider the opportunities and challenges afforded by the next decade. We'll start by considering factors that have made up the headwinds in the last 3 to 5 decades, shocking in all as that timeline is. It's an indictment, in fact, of the passivity and inaction of so many who could have led change but failed to do so. Pleasingly, there are significant tailwinds that need to be celebrated and sustained. More on these to follow. And inevitably, there's also pesky crosswinds that we need to understand if we're to stay the course on the wins achieved so far. Tonight, I want to prosecute the case of these key positions. Reading is a complex, biologically secondary skill. It needs to be taught by highly trained professionals with a specialised body of knowledge about human learning and the nature of the English writing system. Too many children are left behind as a consequence of suboptimal reading instruction and support. The esteem of teaching as a profession is diminished when teachers lack the necessary specialised knowledge and skills for effective reading instruction. And we do have the capacity to disrupt this status quo. Nothing disinfects like sunlight, and teacher voice is the best sunlight we have on shortfalls in ITE preparation for teaching reading. Here's what an honest but deeply betrayed teacher had to say on LinkedIn earlier this year. But I'll never forget when I had this sinking feeling that no one had actually taught me how I would teach a child to read and write. Luckily, I had year 3s. They could already read and write, couldn't they? Wrong. I'm sure as though you've all seen and heard some version of this countless times, and many here today have probably said these words themselves. I showed this slide at a presentation I gave for the South Australian Literacy Guarantee Unit earlier in the year, and to my amazement, a teacher who wrote it was in the audience and made herself known to me afterwards. I'm not sure who was more surprised and delighted, her or me. But this experience sums up the headwinds part of my argument tonight. Keep this new graduate's experience in mind. As you can see here, the main headwinds pushing against reform of reading instruction in recent decades have been the way learning more generally is thought about in ITE circles, and by extension the romantic foregrounding of beautiful children's literature as a substitute for providing teachers with specialised knowledge about the nature of the English writing system. These factors have in turn flourished in the context of government and regulatory body passivity, if you like, the combined fiddling while Rome burns. Since the 1970s, Australian education has been heavily influenced by 20th century theorists such as Dewey, Piaget, Brunner, Freire, Gardner and Vygotsky, all of whom make valuable individual contributions to our thinking about child development and the role of formal education. Altogether, however, they have culminated in an orthodoxy that has conspired against ITE students being exposed to the work of cognitive psychologists on human information processing, working memory, and cognitive load, what we collectively refer to as the science of learning. This theoretical diet is important because it articulates for the kinds of pedagogies that are anointed in ITE, project-based and discovery learning, and those that are dismissed, disparaged and discouraged, explicit instruction in a knowledge-rich curricula. To look at historical fashions in how reading has been taught over recent decades is to look in the mirror of prevailing ideologies about how children learn more generally. This is a high-level timeline showing how things have evolved in Australia since the 1960s. You can all locate yourselves somewhere there, I'm sure. And here we can see the era that has been particularly characterised by the so-called reading wars, the fierce tensions that have been the subject of 3 national inquiries, including our own national inquiry into the teaching of literacy in 2005. Yes, exactly 20 years ago. There were 20 recommendations from that inquiry, none of which were adopted by any state or territory. 20 years later, we do seem to have stopped spinning the wheels, but that's another 20 years of preventable reading failure squandered for thousands of Australian children. None of those national inquiries made recommendations in favour of something called balanced literacy, but that's where things landed for us and other English-speaking nations. We normally like constructs that contain the word balance. We all want balanced diets, balanced wheel alignments, and balanced bank accounts. But balanced literacy, as illustrated here, is neither fish nor fowl. It's not whole language, and it's not structured, explicit literacy teaching. Balance, as applied to reading instruction, has been a Trojan horse for decades of teachers and their students, and also for parents left to pick up the pieces in the best way they can. What does balanced literacy overlook? This is all because balanced literacy has been allowed to turn a blind eye to the factors that you can see listed on this slide. When I look at any kind of instructional model, I'm not looking for eclecticism as a central feature. Flexibility, teacher judgment, and teacher responsiveness are all important, but they need to be set against a background of theoretically grounded instruction. Balanced literacy appeals to the golden mean fallacy, the superficially appealing idea that when there's strongly opposing views, the proponents of each simply need to forge a meeting spot in the middle, regardless of where the weight of evidence actually lies. Balanced literacy is embodied in this folkloric truism that has been handed down by ITE providers to new teachers for the best part of 50 years. You'll note that this is not an archival piece. It was published earlier this year. Thanks, Stephanie. Let's think about this for a moment and its pesky logic problem. There's 7 to 8 billion people on this planet, so there's apparently 7 to 8 billion ways to learn to read. This would make the job of teachers impossible, and would, I suggest, mean that children may as well just stay at home and hope to pick up reading and writing in the same way they picked up oral language, except for the fact that that doesn't work. It's as good as saying to teachers, do whatever you think is a fair thing. Imagine if we said to doctors, there's as many ways of responding to infection as there are patients. Or if we said to pilots, there's as many ways of landing a plane as there are passengers. There's many ways of doing just about anything, but that does not mean they're equally efficacious at scale, a point I'll come back to later on. Balanced literacy, as many here will know, grew out of whole language and its assumptions about reading being a natural process that needs to be fostered rather than taught. As you can see here, there is no mention of a scope and sequence. What is our new teacher on LinkedIn to take away from this pretty infographic? Where's the entry point for our novice learners? What does she teach first? How does she monitor progress? How does she ensure high rates of success in spite of differing starting points? In a breathtaking sleight of hand victory, our reading instruction landscape has been dominated for decades by a reading instruction approach that has no scientific evidence to support it. As you can see here, support for an approach is not the same as evidence for an approach. People support all kinds of approaches to all kinds of problems. Healing crystals for reducing stress, coffee enemas for I'm not sure what, and aura cleansing to purify their energy field, to name a few. This does not mean that they have evidence to back them. Conway and Hogan in the US referred to our current predicament as the balanced literacy hangover. Just as no child should need to recover from their initial reading instruction, I'm looking at you, reading recovery, no teacher should have to shake the hangover of their ITE preparation for reading instruction. The balanced literacy hangover, however, has been a killer. This infographic, which importantly contains a broken timeline, reminds us that reading, writing and spelling are very recent phenomena for our brains. We had spoken language for, we think, a couple of 100,000 years, written language for around 5,000 to 6,000 years, and books for only a matter of centuries. So less than 3% of human existence has involved reading. Our brains haven't worked out yet how to do this on their own, so we need to experience high-quality instruction at school. Reading and writing are biologically secondary skills. Expressed another way, reading and writing are about as old as Stonehenge, but not old enough to have reshaped the neural architecture of the human brain. As Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker reminds us, we have language brains but not reading brains. This message has been reinforced in recent decades by the collective and evolving body of knowledge known as the science of reading, or as we prefer to say at La Trobe, the science of language and reading, hence the acronym SOLAR. The science of language and reading sits alongside other bodies of evolving and emerging knowledge about human cognition, such as memory, perception, attention, and reasoning. It represents decades of rigorous research. It's debated, contested, and self-correcting. It belongs to policymakers, school leaders, and teachers. It's unfortunately been the casualty of an ideology-based knowledge translation crisis. It will have different implications for different groups of children as the evidence changes. In some areas, it has to be probabilistic because we don't have answers to every single question. It's designed to optimise performance for all children at a population level and to prevent reading difficulties. It's not about adults' ideological preferences or the need to appease adults, for example, via that golden mean fallacy. Finally, the science of language and reading draws on testable models of reading. It's not a curriculum or a pedagogy. It's not a commercial product. It goes way beyond phonics, and it is, in fact, a social justice and human rights issue. It reminds us and challenges us that just because there's lots of ways of teaching something doesn't mean that they're all equally effective. It's about evidence-based practice and practice-based evidence. We're learning much from the experience of schools applying the evidence, and this in turn informs the body of knowledge and adds to its depth. And finally, this body of work reminds us that putting adjectives in front of the word literacy, like critical, multiple, and digital, is not the same as teaching children how to read. When children can read, they have access to all kinds of literacy. Perhaps we need to think of decoding as the on-ramp for reading, which in turn is the on-ramp for a much broader construct called literacy, reading, writing, and spelling. Decoding is a necessary but not sufficient skill that has been marginalised and even vilified in some education circles in recent decades. This vilification of decoding has sat alongside and been enabled by what can really only be termed a dumbing down of ITE with respect to knowledge about how the English writing system works. What do teachers need to know about the English writing system? They need to know that, like all writing systems, it's a code for spoken language. It happens to be an imperfect code that makes it the most complex alphabetic writing system in the world. Perhaps counterintuitively, spelling is not the problem. Shifts in pronunciation, both geographically and over time, are the culprit, but this is often not well understood. Teachers need to know that academic scholars have been tinkering with the English writing system for centuries, yet we give children, 5-year-olds, about 36 months to master its inner workings. After that, things become very hit and miss. So all of this means that decoding is a non-negotiable skill and is one key to comprehension and is relevant across year levels, including in the secondary years, where we need to ensure that students can find their way through polymorphemic words. Unfortunately, teachers soon realised, as we saw earlier, that they were probably underprepared at university on this key element of professional practice. If there's any professional group that needs an in-depth knowledge about the history of English at spoken and written levels, surely it is teachers. This means knowing that children absorb common everyday vocabulary, so-called Tier 1 words, into their receptive and expressive language relatively easily through everyday interactions and experiences, but higher order vocabulary, the more academic words encountered in texts and essential for school success and vocational opportunities post-school, is either learnt through direct exposure as a reader for children who can read, or via explicit teaching. Here we're referring, of course, to Tier 2 and 3 words. Tier 2 words are the higher order words that turn up more in written texts, both fiction and non-fiction, and Tier 3 words are subject-specific terms that are usually learned in particular curriculum areas. Tier 2 and 3 words tied to historical influences that postdate the Norman invasion in 1066. The dark line here refers to what an Australian education academic, the late David Corson, referred to as the lexical var. What did Corson mean by the lexical var? He wasn't referring to the kind of watering hole that I quite like to work in. He was actually referring to the fact, as you can see here, that the vocabulary of English falls into two very different categories. There's a striking incompatibility between Anglo-Saxon and Greco-Latin elements in English. The familiar, homely sounding and typically very short words that we learn very early in life and use for most everyday purposes, and the more learned, foreign sounding and characteristically rather long words that are used for academic purposes. So Tier 1 words, if you like, form life's vocabulary starter pack that we all essentially have access to. But that starter pack isn't going to be enough for academic and life success. We need to ensure that classroom instruction provides students with access to Tier 2 and later Tier 3 words, given their critical role in reading comprehension and academic success. But how does the importance of Tier 2 and 3 vocabulary teaching play out in some academic halls of education? In a staggering example of skills for me but not for thee, or perhaps more precisely, skills for my children but not for yours, UK education academic Ian Cushing took aim in this 2024 paper at the explicit teaching of Tier 2 and 3 vocabulary, particularly to children from minority and or disadvantaged backgrounds, positioning such teaching as perpetuating a deficit view of such children. You heard correctly. Cushing concludes in this paper, and I'll quote verbatim, "Tiered vocabulary relies on long-standing colonial logics which co-constructed linguistic and biological deficiencies in the language practices of colonised populations." End quote. I asked ChatGPT to analyse a 1,000-word text sample from this paper, and it told me that of the content words, nouns, verbs and adjectives, 45% were Tier 2 and 35% Tier 3. 80% or luck. So this is a register that privileged white folk are apparently allowed to communicate in, but others not only should not be given such access, but it would be disrespectful to do so. I wonder whether Dr. Cushing provides his own ITE students from different ratiolinguistic backgrounds with an alternative reading, while the white Anglo students are expected to engage with this paper. Compare this position with Corson's observation that a diverse and rich vocabulary is a better tool for dealing with a complex universe. As George Orwell is quoted as saying, "Some ideas are so stupid, only intellectuals believe them." Now, most here today will be familiar with the Matthew effect in learning to read, as described by Keith Stanovich back in the 1980s. It's a New Testament reference to the idea that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, to the fact that what might be a relatively narrow gap between the haves and have-nots at the starting point of school can open up to a yawning cavern quite quickly in the first 3 years of school. Children who do not achieve early success with reading are often left to struggle academically and psychosocially. High-quality instruction can, of course, avert much of the Matthew effect. But you may not be familiar with the so-called Peter effect in teaching reading, a term used by Applegate and Applegate in 2004 to refer to the idea that teachers cannot give what they themselves do not have. That detailed understanding of how the English writing system works for both readers and writers. What does the evidence say about this? There's a large body of research about teacher knowledge of language constructs, and some of this has been published by Australian researchers. Dr. Hannah Stark is a former PhD student of mine who examined teacher knowledge about linguistic constructs relevant to reading. Hannah showed, like many before her, that there's a concerning lack of knowledge on the part of teachers about core linguistic constructs such as phonemes, graphemes, morphemes, and schwa vowels. But perhaps more worryingly, she also identified an inverse relationship between this level of knowledge and teachers' self-confidence in that knowledge. Just think about this for a moment. It means that the teachers with the highest level of knowledge had the lowest levels of self-confidence in that knowledge. But teachers with the lowest levels of knowledge had the highest self-confidence in that knowledge, what you might recognise as the Dunning-Kruger effect. That's not a situation we would want to see occurring in any professional group. Think about how that would play out for surgeons and pilots, for example. What kind of linguistic knowledge did Hannah and other researchers examine? Amongst other things, we're talking about understanding that words can be considered at a number of levels. Teachers need to have an explicit, not just an implicit knowledge about how words work in order to support novices to achieve reading and writing proficiency. This includes knowing what word final E is doing. It doesn't always simply make a preceding vowel say its name, and leveraging morphological awareness to build vocabulary and knowledge of how spelling is influenced by a word's morphological structure. Teachers also need to know about the schwa vowel and how it changes pronunciation, as well as making spelling more challenging. The richness of our language does not begin at the sentence or text level. It begins below the level of the word for those whose eyes and ears are trained to observe and understand how meaning is encoded in written words. In the interest of good science, I'll share that Caitlin Stevenson, who recently completed her PhD in the Solar Lab, supervised by Professor Tanya Seri and me, showed in her research that while speech-language pathologists have stronger knowledge of these constructs than teachers, they displayed knowledge gaps that should not exist. We can all know better and do better, but a pressing uplift is needed on teacher knowledge via their ITE programs. So how are ITE providers responding to these gaps in teacher knowledge? And why are we now looking at an image of two people peering at a glass jar containing tar in a funnel? Let me tell you about the world's longest running laboratory experiment, the famous pitch drop experiment, which commenced in the physics department at the University of Queensland in 1927, to demonstrate that some substances which appear solid are actually viscous. In 1927, Professor Thomas Parnell poured a heated sample of pitch into a sealed funnel and allowed it to settle for 3 years. This was slow science. In 1930, the seal at the neck of the funnel was cut, allowing the pitch to start flowing. A dome-covered funnel is on display outside a lecture theatre at the University of Queensland. If you click on the link on this slide, you'll go to a live webcam feed of something that happens once every 8 to 12 years and has never been witnessed live. You can perhaps see where I'm going here. I think it's fair to say that tar drips through the neck of a funnel at a greater speed and more visibly than the rate of reading instruction change in Australian education faculties. I'm pleased to say that La Trobe has been the first mover on this in recent years, and our graduates are reaping the benefits of this change. The lack of ITE viscosity elsewhere means, unfortunately, that we'll need to continue to invest in on-the-ground teacher professional learning for at least another 10 years, but probably longer. This investment will need to be part of sector and school professional learning budgets, time allocations and coaching resources to bring teachers up to speed and ensure that they feel equipped with critical knowledge and skills essential for them to do their everyday work in classrooms. As I mentioned, La Trobe is the first school of education in Australia that has tackled this knowledge deficit head-on with a rebuild in ITE as well as solid offerings for practicing teachers. Our experience at La Trobe demonstrates the strong appetite among teachers for improved knowledge about the science of reading. We've now had, as we heard earlier, more than 12,000 of them complete our online short courses on this. This recent open access paper describes feedback from a sample of nearly 1,000 of those participants. But it's not efficient or sustainable to be fixing teacher knowledge downstream and having to support teachers to implement new practices and de-implement low-impact approaches. Teachers should not have to pay to undo learning that should never have occurred in the first place because the ideas and practices it embodied were never evidence-based. Think about our medical practitioners, airline pilots and engineers. How much autonomy are they actually allowed to exercise in their everyday decisions? Professions which are held in the highest esteem in our community paradoxically have some of the lowest levels of autonomy, but this is often poorly understood by others. They also face high levels of scrutiny by the community, the media and by regulatory bodies when their judgment and actions are seen to fall short of accepted community standards. This can result in public hearings and humiliating outing of poor practice. But the autonomy accountability trade-off is workable when you have that specialised body of knowledge to start off with. It's a fair contract between you, the community, your professional body, as well as other regulators and your stakeholders. But teachers have been seriously let down in this contract and left to experience the moral injury of not being able to deliver on the core business of teaching other people's children to read. I'm not saying, by the way, that individual teachers should be held to account for suboptimal reading practice, but accountability does need to sit somewhere. And what about academic freedom? For many in education faculty, the academic freedom card has been played as the last word on how decisions should be made about what is taught in ITE programs. This has done the standing of education a great disservice in the halls of academia and in the Australian community more widely. On a matter of such grave population importance as reading instruction and success for all, regardless of postcode, academic freedom has a cameo role at the margins. It must not be the star of the show any more than it should be the star of the show in medicine, nursing, psychology, or engineering. Just a few examples of vocationally orientated disciplines who enjoy high levels of public trust. And while we're talking about accountability, let's call out the parent blame discourse that is loud and unchecked in some quarters. Accountability for reading outcomes must sit with schools, not parents. Where parents can lean in, that should absolutely be encouraged, enabled and celebrated. They have a role, but it's not their job. But it's not okay to run a parent-blame discourse when children struggle with reading, a card that has been paid by some senior education academics in this country and by some high-profile children's authors. So back to this question of how education academics in many Australian universities are responding to the call for higher levels of accountability around teacher knowledge and more explicit application of this in classrooms. The words on this slide tell a powerful story. This is an excerpt from a promo for a recent online event presented by an Australian education academic decrying the intrusion of scientific evidence into Australian policymaking and classrooms. In particular, the presenter took aim at ERO, the Australian Education Research Organisation, though error was not alone in being named as a nefarious force in contemporary education. If I didn't know better, I might wonder whether this was written as a parody of its own argument. Ironically, there has been nothing rapid here, but the sleepers have finally been awoken from their slumber and mistakenly concluded that the fire raging around them was lit overnight. There was nothing overnight about these changes at all. They've been incremental and hard-won and hiding in plain sight on the Mornington Peninsula, for example, for anyone willing to observe and learn from the play. Note too that the so-called crisis characterised here is not the fact that 30% of students are not reaching basic proficiency standards in reading, or the fact that this burden is unfairly borne by students in known equity and diversity groups. No, the crisis is that government and policymakers are galvanised to do something about it. What's different about 2025? We understand that we can't afford to be in the same place or worse in 2035. Happily, it's not all bad news. As you can see here, the tailwinds are picking up and coming from more directions. There's a growing appreciation among teachers and literacy leaders that the soft bigotry of low expectations has historically blinkered their ambitions for students who start from behind based on socioeconomic status, neurodiversity or other risk factors such as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander status, geographic location or English language proficiency. Success should not be dependent on a chance-based instructional golden ticket. It should reflect deliberate and purposeful high-quality teaching. Schools are increasingly cracking the glass ceiling and aiming for success with 90% plus of children. Imagine if only 60 to 70% of children's car seats were actually safe, or if only 60 to 70% of meningitis vaccines actually worked. There would rightly be community outrage and calls for accountability and change. The adoption of improved instructional approaches means that schools direct their instructional resources into high-quality Tier 1 teaching, so that they have adequate resources to support a much smaller number of students who are struggling in spite of exposure to impactful instruction. That proportion should be no more than plus or minus 10%. Who here works in a school with the level of resources identified by Dr. Kerry Hempenstall back in 2013. This resource shifting can only occur when the instructional good china is used every day, rather than holding it back and bringing it out in short, ineffective bursts by the time stubble is bedded down and difficult to shift. This is what we're seeing more and more of as the islands of strong practice get larger and begin to merge. Of course, there will always be a proportion of students whose progress is slower and need additional support. But currently, fewer than 1 in 5 students who are behind by year 3 will actually catch up. How will 15-year-olds leaving school with mid-primary and numeracy skills, if they're lucky, become part of the social and economic mainstream? I'm bringing the house down in, so. With the march of AI into the unskilled workforce, they probably won't. But more and more teachers and schools are being compelled to action by this knowledge, and that, of course, works in students' favour. Schools that are shifting their practice on learning more generally often start by understanding and aligning with a key theoretical model of reading that sparks their understanding and curiosity in equal measure. Teachers in such schools understand that theoretical models are important because they could be tested, verified and falsified through rigorous research. There are a number of such models in the reading science literature, some of which you can see here. Let's have a quick look at the simple view of reading. This is a mathematical formula that tells us that reading comprehension is the product, not the sum, of 2 sets of supporting skills: word identification or decoding on one side and oral language comprehension on the other. The operator is a multiplication sign because anything multiplied by 0 is, of course, 0. It reminds us that readers need keys to 2 locks to understand text. The simple view of reading is not saying that reading is simple. I like to call it an elegant way of representing its core components. It's a testable theory that's been substantiated in many studies over the last 40 years. It reminds us that skills on one side of the equation cannot make up for weaknesses on the other side. That decoding or recognition skills are the on-ramp to the reading comprehension freeway, that learning a code is effortful, so it's going to be slow at first, and that accuracy and fluency promote reading comprehension. So we're shifting students from decoding to recognition to having literally thousands of words orthographically mapped with their spelling, pronunciations, and meanings knitted together in long-term memory. This image shows that decoding is going to be a big part of the mental effort for beginning readers, but once it's established, students' cognitive resources can be almost fully devoted to comprehending increasingly complex texts. As highly esteemed learning scientist Dr. Anita Archer reminds us, when asked why strong decoding skills are vital for all students, there is no comprehension strategy powerful enough to compensate for the fact that you can't read the works. No amount of discussion about main ideas and highlighting keywords will help you if you can't get those words off the page efficiently and effortlessly. More and more teachers are engaging with this important principle. Another tailwind has been the fact that teachers are not only driving the bus with respect to their classroom practice, they're also voting with their feet on the types of professional learning they engage in, very often in their own time, on Saturdays, on school holidays, and in the evenings. Even more pleasingly, teachers are often the lead organisers of research ed and sharing best practice events. The genie is out of the bottle, and teachers are showing that they are indeed bona fide lifelong learners, notwithstanding those moral injuries that they've sustained as a result of graduating from university knowing only low-impact reading instruction practices that left a trail of instructional casualties behind them. An important recent tailwind in Australia has been the leadership shown by sector-level policymakers and jurisdictional leaders. In some cases, this means clear and helpful guidelines and resources, and in Victoria, we've seen an historic mandate on reading instruction, still with much work to do, but a great start. It's worth noting, I think, that schools have never had autonomy on child safety, prevention of anaphylaxis, or staff health and safety, only on the core business of instruction. That's the only area that's been a matter of discretion. Before I move on from tailwinds, I'd like to share an exciting and disruptive plan that's been developed by my colleague, Professor Joanna Barbusis, Dean of Education and Pro Vice-Chancellor of Education, Impact and Innovation of Trobe. Joanna has proposed the creation of an Australian centre, yet to be named, that will drive education impact, innovation and knowledge translation from La Trobe University. Joanna's vision is bold and urgent to turn world-class research into system-wide change and impact at scale. At its centre is a commitment to redefining teacher education and the learning sciences via the mechanisms that you can see listed here. I'm sure Joanna will be pleased to discuss this further with you and accept your blank cheques over a glass of wine this evening. Even if the relevant stakeholders back Joanna's vision, however, there will still be crosswinds to contend with, and these pose a significant challenge to the safe landing of improved instructional experiences for all children, regardless of postcode and other markers of risk with respect to reading success. All of the factors that you can see listed here can act in isolation to thwart change. Banding together, as they have done historically, they are a formidable team of bad actors that do not authentically place children at the centre of reading instruction discourse. There may well be several ways of teaching a child to read, but that doesn't mean that they're equally effective at scale, especially for children who face additional challenges. Whether we're manufacturing cars, making chocolate, or teaching children to read, high quality and high variability cannot coexist. Yet variability, manifesting as teacher autonomy and academic freedom, has almost been a holy sacrament in education faculties. We need to hear more discussion in education circles of the idea of levels of evidence as we hear debated in health and other disciplines. Levels of evidence and choose your own adventure are not compatible. Choose your own adventure is not compatible with professional accountability. Professional accountability is what members of other disciplines sign up for, but it has been all but absent in reading instruction discourse. When we stand for nothing, we fall for everything. A very good place to start then would be to achieve low variance on students' early decoding skills. We can do this by de-implementing approaches that are low impact and replacing them with high impact approaches, the rationales for which need to be clear to teachers. On the subject of decoding, nothing makes a louder mockery of teacher professionalism than having these characters displayed in early years classrooms. They are not decoding strategies. This is a great place to start the de-implementation. What to display instead? Instead, teachers can download Lean Stone's free decoding dragon infographic to display in classrooms, so they are supported to stop inadvertently teaching the habits of weak readers. And I'm delighted, of course, that Lynn is here with us tonight as the Mornington Peninsula resident. It's regrettable that education does not have a good track record with respect to use of evidence and translating it into action in the classroom coalface. A quarter of a century ago, Dr. Louisa Modes observed that unfortunately lack of rigour and respect for evidence in reading education are reinforced by the passivity of education leaders who feel that any idea that can muster a vigorous advocate is legitimate and deserves to be aired. Imagine for a moment that Dr. Motes was talking instead about road safety. The community would stand up on its hind legs and buck at this, and rightly so. If education wants the same esteem as other fields, then it will also need to accept the same level of accountability, and this has to begin with education academics in our training institutions. Policymakers and administrators also need to do their bit. Teachers in classrooms cannot shoulder this burden alone. In health, the Therapeutic Goods Administration tests and approves new drugs and devices before they can be used clinically. There have historically been no checks and balances in education as to what can be rolled out into classrooms, and it is pleasing that this discourse is changing, albeit against resistance in some quarters. I recently read Malcolm Gladwell's newest book, Revenge of the Tipping Point, in which he used the analogy of the rainforest overstory. The overstory is important in maintaining environmental stability both locally and globally. It controls and buffers climate conditions within the forest microclimate. These tallest trees can photosynthesize relatively quickly because of their greater access to sunlight than those in or partially in their shade. This, of course, dictates how much light will filter down to reach lower tiers of plants within the system. I'm sure you can see how this analogy applies to the difficulties associated with instructional change in schools and school systems. Those in education's overstory are far too removed from the challenges, realities and opportunities on the forest floor. Some might even say they have their heads in the clouds. They certainly seem to be breathing different air. In many cases in the last decade, change, where it has been occurring, has stemmed from classroom teachers who invest vast tracts of personal time and money to know better and do better. But those in all levels of the education ecosystem need to ask what best serves the needs of students. A common refrain from those in education faculties is that teaching and teacher preparation are already highly regulated. The argument here goes like this: the fact that we're already highly regulated means we must be doing okay. But trains are also highly regulated by virtue of the fact that they run on tracks. That tells us nothing, though, about what's going on inside their carriages. So the crosswinds will continue to be significant rate limiting factors. If we look to public health, we find many data-driven successes from which education can draw inspiration, ranging across road safety, vaccination and disease prevention, maternal and perinatal infant mortality, and sudden infant death syndrome. Rather than having policy wobbles, these fields have held their nerve. These successes reflect the fact that stakeholders in the entire supply chain work together, from university academics to practitioners at the coalface. We didn't hear excuses that some questions were still unanswered. These fields backed the best available evidence without a prior guarantee of success because of the moral imperative to do so. This graph represents the dramatic drop in sudden infant death syndrome rates in Australia in the last 35 years. But what if, instead, it represented reduction in rates of reading failure over the next 10 years? Because everyone at all layers of the forest canopy got on the bus, stopped making excuses, and worked together to make change happen. There's an ancient Chinese proverb that tells us that the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. We didn't plant a reading instruction tree in 2005 after our national inquiry into the teaching of literacy, but we have planted one now. We just need to ensure that its canopy develops alongside a strong and deep root system so the whole thing doesn't topple before it reaches its full glory. Thank you.
Now we have time for some questions. We'd love to give everyone the opportunity to ask Pam some questions. Does anyone want to start? If not, I have one. I was thinking as you were discussing, Pam, it makes so much sense from the beginning to get it right. But what we have in our system is such a long backlog of children who haven't learned to read. In upper primary, in secondary, the work of the secondaries that we've been really, privileged to support has just revealed how chronic the casualty rate is. Have you got thoughts on what to do about it? Just a small question.
It's a very big question, and in fact, I found my way into early reading instruction via my work on vulnerable adolescents in the youth justice and child protection systems, because I just kind of kept peeling the onion on, how did these children arrive at this point, and they've been to school, and why didn't schooling, why wasn't it a protective factor for them? Why do so many of those students have weak language and literacy skills? I think we do have to see this as a full supply chain issue. I'm actually constantly amazed that secondary teachers, I sometimes think we've broken secondary teachers' will a little bit because it's so normalised for them to have such a high proportion of students in their classes with weak literacy and numeracy skills that their sense of what is normal over time has drifted downwards. But if we're serious about this, we have to have upstream change. We need to continue to invest downstream. I sometimes use the analogy of needing to build better fences at the top of the cliff and not just be parking ambulances at the bottom of the cliff. Whilst we're still producing the number of instructional casualties that we do need those ambulances, and that they need to be properly staffed and they need to be implementing effective practices, because adolescents with weak literacy skills can learn. They can make gains. But, as we saw Kerry Hempenstall saying in 2013, by year 4, it takes 4 times as many resources as it would have taken in year 1. By the time you're looking at a struggling secondary student, there's an exponential multiplier, plus you've got on all of the additional baked on psychosocial, emotional issues, the antipathy towards school, the embarrassment, the humiliation. So then we've got to put resources into those secondary sequelae as well. So it makes no sense for us to stand by and regard this as normal, because it's not normal and it doesn't have to be this way, but we need to be teaching more rigorously from the very outset.
I think, we've had some, I concur because when we started just 3 years ago with Rosebud and Western Port Secondary, the figures were dire. But in the time that both Lisa and Chris have been leading the change in their schools, the change has been, so heartening and so positive. You see it in the DIBELS data and the NAPLAN data, the student responses, the parental engagement and so on. They can work, it certainly is, but I think what it has taken it's a complete reframing of the whole idea of disengagement from being a wellbeing issue to being a learning issue, and I think that has been significant. Lisa and Chris, without putting you on the spot, if you would like to share any of your experiences of it.
Chris, would you like to share your experiences? I've got a question, if I can. I was thinking about your fence at the top of the cliff, and we work in a system now that thankfully has decided that it needs to build a fence at the top of the cliff. But I have some concerns that whilst they've provided the timber poles and the wire, they haven't potentially considered how we're going to get the tension right on that wire, and whether there's a feeling that because we've provided the hardware, that the rest is just going to happen. So I'm curious about your thoughts on what needs to happen, whether that be through IT or university or academics, on how to help the system get that part of it right.
It's a great question, Lisa, and if we're going to get this right and do it properly and invest in generational change, so this is not something that we're going to get right in the next couple of years, this is really generational. We need to be investing in what our pre-service teachers are learning, in the assumptions that they're leaving university with about human learning, how children learn, what the role of classroom instruction is in students' outcomes. So we're not looking at postcodes as being the dictator of outcomes. We're looking at instruction. Instruction's the lever that we can pull. It's the thing that we can change. But if students are paying for degrees that are leaving them so far short of the knowledge and predispositions that they need in order to see themselves, to have that self-efficacy themselves as agents of change in the classroom and able to deliver effective instruction and value students' instructional time. I think that's a huge ethical issue, that students' instructional time belongs to them. It doesn't belong to schools, it doesn't belong to teachers. It's the time that belongs to children that they can't get back again. And I think, if we want to talk about a growth mindset, which is not actually a construct I particularly like, but if we're going to talk about a growth mindset, let's have a growth mindset about what students can learn and how we're going to go about effecting that. But we can't be constantly having to undo the learnings that students are paying for at university. And I think teachers are really saying that with a very loud, clear voice. And the teacher education expert panel report in 2023, the panel chaired by Mark Scott, said that very clearly, that change has to happen at that upper level, so that professional learning, all professions have to engage in professional learning, but it shouldn't be undoing what they learnt as recently as last year and have now incurred a HECS debt for. Professional learning should be building on high quality knowledge and theory driven principles, so there's an ongoing refinement. But at the moment, teachers are needing to do a 180-degree U-turn and then start from behind and come back if we don't lose them in the meantime.
I think that's certainly what we see. Our teachers work so hard, really hard at doing this, because they've got to rethink everything and do the learning that is just undo what they've had before. It's a massive issue for sure. And I think we congratulate definitely all the schools that we're working with, because they work incredibly hard to do this and are seeing some really great outcomes. but it's so minimal without huge amount of effort in right leadership as well. So
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie and Nikki. Pamela, I've got a question that layers onto what Lisa's asked there. What we've heard and what we see in schools is that when graduates come to schools, they become a product of their environment. And like what you said before about the confidence in the wrong stuff inside schools creates problems. And we get graduates that come in and be very confident in what they do, but in the wrong stuff. And your experience, I'm really interested in, Trobe University are driving some amazing stuff, and we love it because we've certainly grabbed onto it in the secondary setting and also the primaries. But across your networks between universities, what are the challenges that exist in breaking that change within the ITE program? Because we know it's right to do what you guys are doing, but many are not. And I've heard senior members of education networks say we need to ignore ITE and we need to work more at the school level because we're not going to be able to change that. Can you give us some insights into that?
Well, Joanna Barbusa's may be better placed to provide insights on that. I think it's fair to say that humans don't like change. The forces in favour of homeostasis are very strong for biological reasons. Homeostasis is a good thing. We don't have meteorological homeostasis today, but in general, things being the same is a good thing. And anyone in this room who's tried to make significant changes in their life knows how hard it is to do that. There's been a huge influence of ideology in education faculties. We all have blind spots. We all have cognitive biases. I think when teacher training left the old teachers' colleges in the 1980s under the Dawkins reforms and went into universities, there was a marriage between education and sociology that hasn't always produced healthy children for ITE graduates. I think sociology is an incredibly important discipline. And I love studying sociology when I was an undergraduate student, but it's not particularly informative about the science of learning and how to embed, behaviour routines in classrooms. Obviously it has a role in those things, but from my perspective, sociology has had too much influence in thinking in initial teacher education, and cognitive psychology has been marginalised. Now, maybe cognitive psychology, has got some culpability there too in terms of ensuring that its findings and learnings are translated into initial teacher education. But Edie Hirsch, Don Hirsch, whose father, as many of you would know, of the idea of core curriculum in the United States, is now well into his 90s, said in a podcast interview I heard a couple of years ago that, and not everyone's going to like me saying this, but schools of education, in fact, and he was talking about America, but I think it applies here too, are more like schools of theology than they are university academic departments, rigorous academic departments, because there's an expectation that everybody believes in the same thing, and it's hard to be a voice of dissent in those kind of environments. Now, this is where I really do want to give a shout out to Joanna Barbusa, our Dean, who has been prepared to really stand up, and as I always said, be the first mover. And say, no, we're standing for something very different at La Trobe. But that's courageous, and any of you who watched Yes Minister will know what that word courageous can mean in some circles. But by doing so, Joanna has called out very publicly the fact that it doesn't need to be this way in schools of education, that there are other ways of approaching ITE and ensuring high quality preparation in the same way that we prepare engineers, doctors, psychologists, nurses, We're not having this discussion about, well, I just don't like that field of research on infection. That's not acceptable in those disciplines, but it has been, it's a culture that has been allowed to evolve in education. And now time has been called on that, and inevitably, there is resistance to that, and people are pushing back. But I think this is the beginnings of change.
Positive note. Perhaps to finish on, unless there's any more questions in the. Well, we have one more. We might need to make that the last.
Hi Pam, I don't want to give you more to do, but I've been thinking as you've been talking about ITE, about postgraduate, and I've been thinking about school leadership, and courses like the Master of Instructional Leadership and Educational Leadership at other universities, and they offer a lot, but we've got a generation of school leaders who, no matter how enthusiastic and willing they are to do this work and lead this work, may not have the knowledge to do it. And Sue Knight recently spoke about that. And so that is something as a school leader that I think about all the time. Do I know enough to lead the team to get this done?
Well, Kat, I think the fact that you even think that way says something about who you are as a school leader, and the Sue Knights and Steve Capps of the world, the Sarah Assomes of the world, they've led from the front on knowledge. They haven't assumed that it's enough to send teachers off to professional learning. They've attended that professional learning themselves. They've deeply engaged with the science. They've understood the theory behind it, and they've gone into classrooms. They've gone and visited schools that are, as I said, exemplars of practice-based evidence. Well, there's plenty of evidence out there for us to call on for it to be changing our practice, but now we need to be looking at that practice-based evidence. And the schools that are making the change, I think, provide great opportunities for leaders to be modelling their own practice on. We don't have to reinvent every wheel and make every mistake to go forward. We should be operating in communities of practice at the leadership level, just as we want teachers to be working in those communities of practice.
I think that's a great endorsement of the cluster work that's happening on the peninsula. Chris was leading that work and sharing the challenges, but also the leadings. Our speaker, before we invite Theo to close the evening, you could thank you very much for a fantastic. Thank you.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be with you this evening. So I grew up spending my summers on the blustery west coast of Ireland. And so I want to begin by thanking the MPF for turning on the weather for me. Videos home. Thank you, Stephanie and Pam, for the fantastic discussion. And importantly, thank you, Pam, for a really thought-provoking lecture. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and any First Nations folks that are with us this evening. I'm 20 months in the role as the Vice Chancellor of La Trobe. It's such a privilege to have this fantastic partnership with the Mornington Peninsula Foundation. The partnership is all about delivering a lecture, an annual oration on a topic that is important for local community and for our nation. I think you agree with me that distinguished Professor Pamela Snow has delivered in spades. But more than that, I'm reflecting on the fact that we talk about a call to action. I think that term is overused. I think there's a quiet anger in Pam's lecture that is real call to action, actually. I learned a lot. I'm really proud to have Pam as a distinguished professor in our university. On behalf of the La Trobe community, I'd like to thank Ian Kicks, AO, and Andrew Fairley down the back there, AM, and everyone involved with the foundation for their leadership in addressing disadvantage here on the Mornington Peninsula. and particularly in supporting programs based on the science of learning. From where I stand, it's hard to think of anything more important than teaching children how to read, and doing so that's based on the science and learning and evidence of what actually works in the classroom. It's quite staggering. Here we are in Australia at this day and age, and we have so many children failing literacy, and it's just been tolerated for decade after decade. It's really staggering. Teachers quite literally nurture and shape the future generations and the future of our economy and society in Australia. And I think we all acknowledge that teachers and principals, the school leadership, they bring a passion to what they do. I must confess, my attention was drawn to Sold the Story, the podcast, which is about similar story of what's happened to the United States. And it's heart-wrenching to hear stories of teachers who have discovered that for years they've been practicing something that has failed their students. And when that dawns on them, it's heartbreaking, actually. And that's why at La Trobe we are so determined to drive systemic change through programs that are being delivered by Pam and her colleagues in our School of Education. In fact, we've recently recast our university strategy to take us forward to 2030. And we're a university that has huge strength in health and science. That's like the half of what we do as a university is health and science. But the impact of the work that's been led by Pro-Vice Chancellor and Dean Joanna Barbuses, as you've heard this evening, and the courage to say, we're going to chart a new path forward, learning from the work the research that's been done in the school. It's so impactful that we've taken education up and we've made it one of the 3 top areas. We're a university that's a world leader in health, science, and now education. It's core to what we're doing as a university. We're very excited for the vision around an Australian centre, because now we have the science, now we have to change policy settings. Now the hard work begins to support our school leaders and principals to transform school workforces across our country to deliver for our students. That's a big challenge. Now, at Trobe, we have big ambitions to take forward this task. As Pam said, there's nothing short of a moral imperative to do so, but we can't do it on our own. And so, for example, I'd like to acknowledge this evening that Deb Morgan, Natasha Bryce, and Bruce Horncutt are here from the Helen Macpherson Smith Trust. The Trust is a great supporter of La Trobe University, and in particular our unique employment-based pathway to teaching, which we call Nexus, which is making a difference, particularly to address teacher shortages in regional and hard-to-staff schools. But also I'd like to particularly acknowledge two among our most generous supporters who aren't here this evening, but have been incredibly important to the work that we do. Neville and Diana Bartelli, who also happen to be patrons of MPF. Thanks to the generosity of Neville and Diana, we have made huge progress in our work here on the science of language and reading. And in particular, I want to acknowledge this is work that's been taken forward, led by distinguished Professor Pam Snow, but also Professor Tanya Seri. Tanya is co-founder of the SOALA, and she's the lead researcher for a series of projects funded by the Bartelli Family Foundation that have built teacher knowledge of the science of learning and reading and greatly improved reading outcomes for students. So Pam and Tanya together and with the larger team have created immense momentum for positive change. We're pleased that findings from their research in the Solar Lab have informed the introduction of evidence-based approaches to classrooms across Victoria as well as New South Wales. Here I want to pull out the courageous leadership of our Deputy Premier and Education Minister, Ben Carroll. Ben, we are very fortunate to have a minister that basically has stood up and, in essence, gone against his own department and teaching unions and said, no, the evidence is compelling. We are going to change. There's a lot more work forward, but it's a great start. And it follows on the incredible success in Solar Lab. On the short courses delivered with that lab and have already helped 12,500 educators to adopt explicit teaching methods. And now we're applying the same approach to numeracy. And so the La Trobe School of Education has launched the Science of Mathematics and Education, the SOM Lab, so we have Solar Lab and a SOM Lab, that will help teachers demonstrate mathematical procedures in a structured way. And we're very fortunate to have received a $1.5 million grant from the Australian Education Research Organisation to expand also evidence-based coaching. Just want to just wrap up by saying that, we're a university that's proud of doing real-world impact. So we have researchers working in all different fields, but our kind of tagline is the impact is real. And actually, when I arrived as the Vice Chancellor, the team were like, okay, do we change the tagline? Because, a new CEO, a new tagline. I was like, no, that's a fabulous tagline. We're a university where colleagues do research because they want to have real-world impact. And, you go out and you talk to colleagues in all different disciplines. That's actually what they're doing. That is what really drives the heart of the university. So I was like, don't touch that. That's a fabulous one. And so we're proud of being a university where inclusion and innovation produce real-world impact. And I think the kind of work that Pam and Tanya have done and what Pam has discussed this evening perfectly demonstrates that. It's literally making all the difference to the thousands and thousands of young Victorians and their parents and families and our shared future as a state and a country. And so on that note, I'd just like to end by inviting everyone, as the wind has dropped, to please put your hands together once more to thank distinguished Professor Pam Snow for her incredible lecture and the impact that her work and Tanya's work is going to make to lives of our country. Thank you.